At 6:31 a.m. on June 6, 1944, Private First Class Daniel Hargrove lay flat against the shingle at Omaha Beach with an M1 Garand in his hands and a decision already made that would follow him for the rest of his life. He would not fire it. Not yet. Not into the smoke and confusion where 40 men from his own boat section were pinned beneath a machine gun nest that hadn't been marked on any map. In the next 50 minutes, Hargrove would move through open fire without loosing a single round, using nothing but timing, silence, and a soldier's understanding of sound itself to lead every one of those 40 men off the beach alive. The men who watched him do it called him a coward before they understood what he was actually doing. By the time the sun cleared the bluffs above the beach, they would call him something else entirely. The ramp of Landing Craft 47 dropped into 4 feet of churning gray water at 6:29 a.m., 2 minutes before Hargrove made the choice that would define his war. The first 6 men off the ramp died before their boots found sand. Machine gun fire raked the surf in long traversing bursts, and the beach ahead was a wall of noise, mortar concussion, the tearing crack of MG-42s firing at twice the rate of anything the Americans carried, men screaming orders that nobody could hear over the sound of their own deaths. Hargrove went into the water up to his chest, rifle held overhead, and felt the cold hit him like a physical blow that had nothing to do with the temperature. Sergeant Walter Kinney went down 8 feet from the ramp, a burst catching him across the chest before he'd taken 3 steps through the surf, and it was that single moment, Kinney folding into the surf without a sound of his own, that pushed everything else in Daniel's mind into total silence. Around him, the surviving men of the boat section were scattering, diving behind beach obstacles, firing blind bursts toward a tree line 400 yards distant where they could see muzzle flashes but no clear targets. Daniel reached a steel hedgehog obstacle 20 yards up the beach, pressed himself against its cold metal, and did the one thing that would define the next 50 minutes of his life. He listened. What he was listening for went back further than this beach, further than the war itself, back to a boy in the Cascade foothills of Washington state, and a father who had spent 30 years teaching him that everything in this world, even chaos, has a rhythm underneath it, if a man is patient enough to find it. Daniel Hargrove was raised in a small logging town in the Cascade foothills of Washington state, the son of a timber surveyor who spent 30 years walking silent forest lines, judging distance and grade by eye, teaching his son to move through dense woods without snapping a single branch. Sound travels different than you think it does, his father used to say, crouched beside a creek bed, listening to something Daniel couldn't yet hear. Learn where it goes before you learn where you're going. By the time Daniel was 16, he could walk within 30 feet of a bedded deer without it lifting its head. He could tell you which direction an axe was falling 3 ridgelines away, just from the way the sound bent around the terrain. It was a strange, quiet skill, the kind that never seemed useful for anything beyond the woods he'd grown up in. Daniel's mother had died when he was 9, and in the years afterward it was his father, Walt Hargrove, who raised him almost entirely inside the working rhythm of the timber trade. Walt surveyed boundary lines for logging companies across 3 counties, walking alone for days at a time through second-growth forest, marking property corners, judging the health of stands by ear and eye alone. He brought Daniel along whenever the school calendar allowed it, and those trips became the boy's real education, far more than anything taught in a one-room schoolhouse. Walt would stop mid-stride sometimes, hold up a flat hand, and simply listen for a full minute before saying anything at all. "Everything out here makes a sound eventually," he told Daniel once, crouched beside a fallen log, waiting on something the boy couldn't yet identify. "Wind's got a pattern. Water's got a pattern. Even silence has got a pattern, if you're patient enough to notice when it breaks." Daniel didn't understand the lesson at the time. He understood it completely 9 years later, on a beach in Normandy, when a machine gun's silence turned out to be the only pattern that mattered. By the time he was 14, Daniel could walk a quarter-mile through dense underbrush without snapping a single dry branch, timing each footfall against the wind so that any noise he made was swallowed by noise the forest was already making. He could tell, from 3 ridgelines away, whether a distant axe blow had struck green wood or dead wood, just from the character of the echo bouncing back off the surrounding hills. It was, as he'd tell people later, a completely useless skill for anyone who wasn't planning to spend his life surveying timber, until the fall of 1942, when his draft notice arrived and the United States Army discovered, almost by accident, that it had a use for a young man who could hear things other men couldn't. He was drafted in the fall of 1942 and shipped to Fort Benning for basic infantry training, where the emphasis was speed, aggression, and volume of fire, everything his father's forest lessons had never touched. Basic training moved at a pace that felt, to Daniel, almost violently rushed. Drill instructors preached the doctrine of the moment: overwhelming firepower, rapid target acquisition, the idea that hesitation of any kind was a soldier's fastest route to a grave. Daniel qualified as marksman easily enough during rifle qualification week. His eye was steady, and years of tracking game through dense brush had given him a patience most 18-year-old recruits simply didn't possess. But something in him resisted the broader doctrine of suppressive fire, the notion that the correct response to an unseen enemy was simply to put more lead into the air until something, anywhere, stopped shooting back. An instructor at Benning, a hard-edged staff sergeant named Pruitt who'd fought in North Africa, once pulled Daniel aside after a live-fire exercise and asked why he'd hesitated a full half-second longer than the men beside him before engaging a pop-up silhouette target. "I want to know what I'm shooting at before I shoot it," Daniel said, without much apology in his voice. Pruitt studied him for a long moment, the way a man studies something he isn't quite sure he believes. "That's a fine way to get killed in real combat," Pruitt finally said, "where hesitation is a luxury nobody survives long enough to enjoy twice." Daniel didn't argue with him. He simply kept doing it his own way in every exercise that followed, listening a half-beat longer, moving a half-beat later, trusting the gap between sounds more than he trusted the urge to simply react, and it kept working, consistently, in ways that none of the instructors could fully explain away as luck. Word of it spread quietly through his training company over the following months, the way small oddities do among men living in close quarters. Daniel became, without ever seeking the reputation, the man other recruits wanted beside them during night land navigation exercises, because he seemed to know, well before anyone else, when an umpire team was closing in from the tree line, or when a supposedly silent ambush party had given itself away with a single misplaced boot fall 200 yards out. He never bragged about it. He rarely spoke about it at all. It was simply the way he'd been raised to move through the world, transplanted now into a uniform and a rifle that felt, most days, like tools he was still learning to trust as much as he trusted his own 2 ears. He crossed to England with the 1st Infantry Division in late 1943 and spent the following months in training exercises along the Devon coastline, rehearsing amphibious landings that felt, at the time, like elaborate theater with no real stakes. It was during those months that Sergeant Walter Kinney, a career soldier 12 years Daniel's senior, noticed something the other officers had missed. Kinney watched Hargrove during a night exercise, tracking his squad's movement purely by ear across 200 yards of dark terrain, correctly calling out enemy positions that the umpires confirmed only after checking their own notes. "Where'd you learn to do that?" Kinney asked afterward. "My father," Daniel said. "He surveyed timber for 30 years. You learn to hear the woods, you can hear just about anything." Kinney didn't say much else that night, but he requested Hargrove for his own boat section 3 weeks later, a request that would put Daniel Hargrove in Landing Craft 47 on the morning of June 6, 1944, instead of scattered somewhere else along the 8-mile stretch of Omaha Beach. The final briefing aboard the transport ship, delivered less than 12 hours before the ramp dropped, had promised the men of the 1st Infantry Division that naval bombardment and heavy bombers would soften the German defenses along this stretch of coastline well before the first wave ever touched sand. Officers had walked the men through sand table models of the beach, pointing out where the worst resistance was expected to be light, where engineers would already have cleared paths through the obstacle belts, where the bluffs above would already be cratered and burning by the time the landing craft arrived. It was, in hindsight, a briefing built almost entirely on assumptions that would not survive contact with the actual morning of June 6. Low cloud cover over the Normandy coast had forced the heavy bombers to delay their release points by several crucial seconds, afraid of dropping short onto their own approaching troops, and the result was that most of the intended ordnance sailed harmlessly over the bluffs entirely, detonating uselessly in open farmland well behind the German lines. The naval bombardment that followed lasted barely half the planned duration before the first wave was ordered in, leaving the bulk of the German fortifications along this section of beach almost entirely untouched. The result, by the time Landing Craft 47 began its final run toward shore, was a beach defended nearly exactly as the Wehrmacht engineers had originally designed it. A killing field of interlocking machine gun fire arcs, pre-ranged mortar pits, and belts of steel obstacles, all of it still fully intact and waiting. Daniel had spent the final approach crouched low in the landing craft alongside 30 other men, most of them silent, a few praying under their breath, the boat pitching hard through 4-foot swells that had already left half the section seasick before they'd fired a shot. Sergeant Kinney moved among them in the final minutes, checking gear, offering the kind of gruff reassurance career soldiers give young men who have never been shot at before. "Stay tight, move fast, listen for my voice," Kinney told them, raising it over the drone of the engine and the increasingly loud crack of gunfire growing closer with every passing second. Daniel remembered, in the last, calm moment before the ramp dropped, that his father's voice was the one he was actually listening for underneath all of it, the old instruction to notice when a pattern breaks. He didn't yet know how badly he would need it. Every burst of American fire that morning drew a heavier response from the German positions, 3 bullets back for every one sent forward, because the defenders had the advantage of pre-ranged fire lanes and the Americans did not. Daniel reached a steel hedgehog obstacle 20 yards up the beach and pressed himself against its cold metal, rifle still unfired, and did the only thing his father had ever really taught him to do under pressure. He listened, not to the chaos. The chaos told him nothing, but underneath it, for the specific rhythm of the gun that had killed Sergeant Kinney. He picked it out within 30 seconds. A machine gun nest positioned in a concrete emplacement roughly 300 yards up the bluff, firing in disciplined 3-second bursts with almost exactly 4 seconds of silence between them, the gunner conserving his barrel the way a well-trained crew would. 4 seconds. That was the gap. That was the only gap that existed on this entire beach, and Daniel Hargrove understood, with the same clarity he'd once used to time his footsteps around a bedded deer, that 4 seconds was enough to move, if you moved at exactly the right moment, and not one heartbeat sooner. The man nearest him, a private named Foster, grabbed Daniel's shoulder and screamed something about returning fire, about laying down suppression so the rest of the section could advance. Daniel shook his head and pointed instead toward the timing of the gun, mouthing the count under the noise. 3, 2, 1. And on the next silence, he moved. Not toward the enemy, toward the next piece of cover, 15 yards up the beach, reaching it with a full second to spare before the gun fired again. Foster stared at him like he'd lost his mind. Daniel hadn't fired a single round. He'd simply moved, exactly once, exactly when the gun couldn't reach him, and he was 15 yards closer to getting his section off the open sand. Word began to spread through the scattered remnants of the boat section in the strange, compressed way that information moves in combat, not through orders, but through men watching another man do something that worked and choosing, out of pure survival instinct, to copy it. Daniel worked his way from obstacle to obstacle, always on the same 4-second rhythm, and each time he moved, 2 or 3 more men saw the pattern and moved with him, using his timing instead of their own panic. He never fired. Every second spent working the bolt of his rifle was a second not spent counting the gun's rhythm, and the rhythm was the only thing keeping any of them alive. Some of the men thought he'd frozen, that fear had locked him into some kind of paralysis where he could move but couldn't fight, and in the chaos of the beach, that looked very much like cowardice. It was Private Foster who said it out loud, 20 minutes into the advance, crouched behind a burned-out tank obstacle with 6 other men clustered close, waiting on Daniel's signal. "You haven't fired once," Foster said, disgust cutting through his fear. "Kinney's dead and you're just counting. What the hell are you doing?" Daniel didn't answer right away. He was listening to the gun again, recalibrating, because the crew had shifted their rhythm slightly in the last 2 bursts. The gunner was tiring, the pauses stretching from 4 seconds toward 4.5. That half-second mattered. It was the difference between reaching the next piece of cover clean or reaching it with a bullet already in the air. "Get ready," Daniel finally said. "Next. Gaps longer. Move when I move." Foster called him a coward under his breath, loud enough for the men around him to hear, and nobody corrected him, because from where they crouched, cowardice was the only explanation that made sense. The gun paused. Daniel counted the half-second extension, confirmed it, and moved, 30 yards this time, further than any single push yet, because the gap had genuinely opened wider. 6 men moved with him on faith alone, no longer needing to be told twice, and all 6 reached the next depression in the sand without a scratch. Behind them, another section 40 yards east had attempted the same distance during a normal 4-second gap and lost 2 men to fire that arrived a half-second before they expected it. Daniel's timing wasn't luck, it was the same skill that let a 14-year-old boy red an axe fall 3 ridgelines away, applied now to a machine gun that behaved, underneath all its horror, exactly like every other rhythmic sound his father had ever taught him to hear. By 7:10 a.m., Daniel's group had worked its way to within 80 yards of the base of the bluff, close enough that the machine gun's angle of fire could no longer reach the ground directly beneath it, a dead zone the Germans had likely never worried about, because no American section had gotten close enough to find it. Daniel called the men into that pocket of safety and, for the first time since the ramp dropped, allowed himself 30 seconds to actually think rather than simply count. 40 men. That was the tally he'd gathered without ever intending to become anyone's leader, remnants of 3 different boat sections, all of them following the man who wouldn't fire his rifle, because following him was the only thing on this beach that hadn't gotten anyone killed. The machine gun nest itself remained the problem. It couldn't reach them where they were, but it commanded every yard of open beach behind them, and more landing craft were still coming in, still walking into the same killing field Daniel's section had barely survived. He understood, crouched in that dead zone with 40 exhausted men around him, that counting gaps had gotten his own section to safety, but it would do nothing for the waves still landing behind them. Somebody needed to silence the gun itself, and Daniel Hargrove, who had not fired a single round all morning, was the only man among them who knew its exact rhythm well enough to know precisely when its crew would be reloading, heads down, blind to anything approaching from the dead zone below. He explained it to the men in short, clipped sentences, the same economical way his father used to give instructions before a difficult shot. The gun fired in 3-second bursts. The crew needed roughly 11 seconds to change a belt when it ran dry, and by his count, they were close. He'd been tracking rounds fired since the ramp dropped, and the belt was nearly finished. When it emptied, there would be an 11-second window instead of a 4-second one, and during that window, the position would be completely blind. He asked for 4 volunteers to go up with him, using the dead zone's terrain to reach the emplacement from below while the rest of the section held position and watched for a second gun he suspected was covering the first from a flanking angle he hadn't yet located. Foster was the first to volunteer, the same man who'd called him a coward less than an hour earlier, his expression now carrying something closer to raw trust than shame. 3 others followed. Daniel led them up a shallow defilade cut into the bluff face, moving in total silence, counting rounds under his breath the entire climb, until the gun finally choked off mid-burst, the belt exhausted exactly when he'd predicted. Give or take a single second. The 4 men reached the emplacement's rear entrance 11 seconds later, exactly as the German crew was threading a fresh belt into the breach, heads down, ears still ringing from their own weapon, and it was Foster, not Daniel, who fired the first shot of the entire engagement, ending the 2-man crew before either of them looked up. The second gun Daniel had suspected was there, angled to cover the first position's blind spot from 60 yards further along the bluff, and it opened up the moment the first gun went silent, spraying the defilade with fire that caught one of the 4 volunteers in the leg before the group scrambled back into the dead zone's cover. Daniel dragged the wounded man the last 10 feet himself, absorbing a graze along his own forearm that he wouldn't fully register until nearly an hour later. The wounded man, a 19-year-old private named Coyle who'd landed with a different boat section entirely and simply attached himself to Daniel's group somewhere along the beach, gritted his teeth against the pain and asked, half laughing through it, whether Daniel had counted this gun's rhythm too. Daniel had. He'd clocked it during the climb, a faster cycling rate than the first position, likely a fresher crew with a fuller supply of ammunition belts, which meant it would not run dry as conveniently as the first gun had. That meant a second silent approach was no longer an option. The dead zone below the bluff no longer offered protection from this angle, and Daniel understood, crouched beside a bleeding 19-year-old and 3 exhausted volunteers, that the only way to move the remaining 35 men safely up the slope was to draw the second gun's attention somewhere else entirely. He sent Foster and 1 other man back down to the main group with instructions to begin moving in short, staggered rushes along the eastern edge of the dead zone, visible just enough to pull the gunner's eye that direction, while Daniel and the last volunteer worked their way along a narrow goat track on the western side of the bluff, out of the gun's traverse arc entirely. It was slower. It was also the only option that didn't put another man on the ground. The plan held for 11 minutes, the second gun firing in long, frustrated bursts at shadows and movement along the eastern rushes, never quite finding a clean target because Foster had learned, in the space of one bloody hour, exactly how to move the way Daniel had taught him without either man saying so out loud. By the time Daniel reached a firing position on the western goat track, close enough to see the second emplacement's rear entrance through a gap in the scrub brush, the gun crew had gone through nearly 2 full belts chasing movement that was never actually there. He had no rifle round left that he trusted to reach cleanly through the narrow gap without alerting the crew before the shot landed true, so he did the only other thing available to him. He waited for the gun to fire, used the report itself to mask his approach the final 15 yards, and reached the position with his combat knife before either crew member registered that the sound closing on them from behind wasn't wind. It was over in under 4 seconds. Neither gun on that stretch of bluff fired again for the remainder of the morning. From the safety of the dead zone, with both guns silenced, the 40 men Daniel had gathered now had a clear lane up the bluff that no longer funneled directly into interlocking fire, and he used the next 20 minutes to guide them up it in small, staggered groups, timing each movement now more out of exhausted habit than genuine necessity, since the threat that had shaped every second of the last 2 hours simply no longer existed. By 8:15 a.m., all 40 men had reached the relative safety of a sunken lane above the bluff line, regrouping with elements of a heavier assault force that had finally begun to break through further along the beach. Daniel sat against a stone wall, forearm bleeding through a hastily applied bandage, and found Foster sitting beside him without either of them saying much for several minutes. It was Foster who finally spoke. "I called you a coward," he said. "On the beach. I said it loud enough for everybody to hear it." Daniel shook his head slightly, still catching his breath, still hearing, somewhere underneath the exhaustion, the last rhythm of a gun that no longer existed. "You weren't wrong to wonder," he said. "I wasn't fighting the way anybody expected me to fight." Foster looked out over the bluff, down toward the beach where the tide was already beginning to erase the worst of the morning's wreckage. 40 men, he said quietly. "You didn't fire a shot for the first 2 hours, and 40 men are standing here because of it." By late morning, the sunken lane above the bluff had become a staging point for a much larger push inland, as heavier units finally broke through the beach defenses further east and began linking up with the scattered pockets of men who'd fought their way up through the morning's chaos. An officer from battalion headquarters, moving up the line to assess the situation, found Daniel's group first among the survivors on that stretch of bluff and asked, with some visible confusion, how 40 men from 3 different boat sections had ended up consolidated together, and how 2 machine gun positions that battalion intelligence had marked as still active only an hour earlier were now confirmed silent. Foster answered before Daniel could say anything at all. "He got us up here," Foster said, nodding toward Daniel, who was sitting against the stone wall with his forearm freshly bandaged by a corpsman who'd finally caught up to the group. "Didn't fire a shot the whole way, and we're all still breathing because of it." The officer studied Daniel for a long moment, the same way Sergeant Pruitt had studied him back at Fort Benning nearly 2 years earlier, trying to reconcile a soldier's quiet manner with the scale of what he'd apparently just done. He asked Daniel directly how he'd known when to move, how he'd read the timing of an enemy machine gun crew he'd never seen and never spoken to. Daniel thought about how to answer that for a moment, aware that the true answer, that his father had taught him to listen for the pattern beneath the noise, walking silent timber lines in the Cascade foothills a decade earlier, would sound, to most men in that uniform, like something closer to superstition than soldiering. "Guns don't lie about their rhythm," Daniel finally said. "You just have to be patient enough to hear it before you trust it." The officer wrote something down in a small notebook and moved on to the next group, and Daniel never learned exactly what words ended up in the report that followed, only that they were apparently enough. Daniel Hargrove would be recommended for the Distinguished Service Cross for his actions that morning, the citation noting, with some visible difficulty in finding the right language for it, his exceptional and unconventional leadership under fire, a phrase that failed entirely to capture what had actually happened on that beach. He had not led with aggression or firepower. He had led by listening, by understanding a killing field the way his father had once understood a silent forest, reading rhythm and gap and timing where every other man on that beach could hear only chaos. The 2 machine gun crews he and Foster silenced that morning had been credited, in post-war accounts, with holding up the advance of nearly 2 full companies before they finally fell, a delay that had cost dozens of lives in the sections that hadn't found their own version of Daniel's rhythm. Private Coyle, the young man Daniel had dragged the final 10 feet into cover with a bullet in his leg, survived the war and would later say, in a brief interview recorded decades afterward, that he never once heard Daniel Hargrove raise his voice on that beach, not even in the worst of it, and that the silence itself had somehow been more reassuring than any amount of shouted encouragement could have been. Foster stayed close to Daniel for the remainder of the campaign through France, the two men forming the kind of wordless friendship that combat sometimes produces between men who have watched each other survive something neither fully expected to survive. He would later tell his own children that the bravest thing he ever saw in the war wasn't a man charging forward under fire, it was a man standing still, listening, while 40 other men trusted him enough to wait. Daniel Hargrove never spoke much about the medal afterward, and he never fully explained to anyone outside that beach why he'd waited so long to fire his rifle that morning. He carried Sergeant Kinney's dog tags off that beach himself, tucked beside his own for the rest of the war, a quiet reminder of the man whose voice he'd been listening for underneath all of it since the ramp first dropped. He didn't need to explain any of it. The 40 men who walked off Omaha Beach behind him already understood, and that understanding, quiet and spoken, carried by men who owed him their lives without ever needing him to say so, was the only recognition he ever seemed to want.